I'm speaking with Amanda Ann Klein, author of Millennials Killed the Video Star, MTV's Transition to Reality Programming, published February 26, 2021 by Duke University Press Books. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me.
So first, how did you get into studying this subject and writing a book on it?
Well, I'm trained in media studies, primarily film studies, but my first book was on the subject of film genres and cycles. So I'm taking a similar approach with looking at reality television as a particular production cycle on MTV at this moment in time. But in terms of how I landed on this topic, it was really because I was a fan. A big fan of not only the kind of the new wave of reality television that we started to see in the early 2000s, but particularly of MTV's reality TV shows like The Hills and Laguna Beach. I watched with my husband, and we were just fascinated, especially by the disconnect, because by the Great Recession, there were so many people struggling financially, especially young adults graduating and trying to find a job after college, and the women in these shows were just incredibly successful, and every job they interviewed they got, and nobody worried about money. So that was sort of the entry point for me, the disconnect between kind of what you're seeing as this is youth culture today versus what was actually happening. So I started to write some articles on the topic, and then over the years I realized I should probably look back at all this and try to put it into a single book. So that's kind of the origin. So probably about 10 years now, at least, thinking about these shows.
And the book seems to cover, at least from the description, like from 95 to, and I would guess about mid 2010s.
So basically, the shows that are the primary focus of my argument really start around 2004. And I try to get up, I finished writing the book in late 2019. So I basically cover what I could up until that point. But I do cover the prehistory of these shows, which not only includes The Real World, which started in 1992 on MTV, but also just the reality TV that was on American television prior to MTV. So, Candid Camera and Queen for a Day and An American Family from the 70s. So, there's a lot of precedent there. So there's some history at the beginning, and then I focus in on the MTV shows.
So how do you break out the book? Do you sort of, from that point, do you examine show by show or certain themes?
I've been looking at themes. That was actually, I would say, one of the hardest parts of figuring out this book was how I wanted to talk about these shows. I knew that they were all part of the same production cycle, but what's the most useful way to think about them? And I ended up bracketing them off by, I took The Real World as its own case study, because that is, such a monumental show on MTV, but also just in the history of reality television. And then I picked shows like The Hills and Laguna Beach and Teen Mom for the way they talk to young white women in particular, and kind of the life choices that are presented as being options for young white women, which is, essentially, if you succeed, it's because you did it and you worked hard. And if you fail, it's because you messed up and it's also your fault. So it's kind of this post-feminist options offered to young white women. I also look at shows in another chapter that create ways for white youth to see themselves as something other than white. So you see that in a show like Jersey Shore, in Buck Wild, which takes place in West Virginia. They like to call themselves rednecks. The Jersey Shore kids call themselves Guidos. So it's kind of this white anxiety and this feeling of, finding a place, and this need to identify with something that is beyond being white. So you see that in those shows. And then I do a chapter on shows that failed. within this production cycle. And basically what I'm looking at in those shows, like, for example, Washington Heights, which only ran for one season. It was focused on Dominican American teens and 20-somethings living in Washington Heights, New York. And a show like that, you'd think it would do great because Jersey Shore was such a hit, but it was not really stereotyped. It was too nuanced and subtle. And so the shows that failed are, really showcase how when MTV did attempt to portray non-white youth, non-straight youth as, as subject matter without lampooning them, without kind of indulging in catchphrases and stereotypes, those shows just proved to be not very interesting to MTV's audience, which again is mostly white. So that's kind of how I ended up breaking down the chapters is, what messages are being generated through the production of these shows and, how were they received ultimately by audiences?
So having listened to what you just said, it seems like any non-white or I don't want to say standard, I don't know what the best term would be, someone who's part of the majority, it would seem that, on one hand, someone might argue, oh, those characters are there as tokens to draw in a mixed audience, but now it sounds like they were simply there as a way for white audiences to communicate with non-whites through the show.
Absolutely. And I think the reason why The Real World, why I kind of have it as my first big kind of analytical chapter is because it really sets the template for exactly that. So when The Real World went on the air, the reason, and Jonathan Murray and Mary Ellis Bonham, who were the creators, they felt that so they couldn't afford a scripted TV series about teenagers like Beverly Hills 90210. So to save money, they said, let's do it kind of in a documentary fashion. And so how do you create drama without paid actors and scripts and costumes? Well, you put some people who are interesting, but also supposedly different from one another. And those differences will generate conversation and argument and conflict and drama. So they picked people that they felt were different from one another. But ultimately, what it ended up being for pretty much the whole history of this show is there is a presumed white subject of the audience who is identifying with the white subject on the screen. And so when that white subject walks into a room and says, I've never met a Jewish person before, or, oh boy, I've never met a strong Black woman, I don't know what to do with this. And it becomes this kind of learning journey for the white character on screen. And that was a big part of The Real World's kind of mission is this, oh, look what we're doing. We're giving, today's youth an opportunity to grapple with these important topics. But what kind of got left out of that narrative is that it's only a lesson and it's only learning for a particular segment of the population. And that is, white kids. A Black teenager watching The Real World does not need a lesson in understanding how racism works. That's their daily life. So it was an implied and assumed white viewer who is kind of learning these big life lessons. On a show like The Real World. Now that changes with later iterations of MTV series, where it's not so much about learning lessons about tolerance as it is kind of glorifying and kind of wallowing in stereotypes of different groups.
So at what point did the show, I guess starting with Real World, at what point did it go from just being a show that started to be successful to being part of a cycle?
Well, so that's a good question. So when The Real World comes out, it is sort of an outlier, or not sort of, it is an outlier on MTV. There are no other series like it. MTV had been toying with having series that were non-music videos for, since it started, really. They were playing around with, MTV News or game shows or, little skits, things like that. But, In 1992, again, in an attempt to try to have some non-video content, they create the show The Real World. But MTV doesn't go too deep into reality programming at that point. Even when the show becomes a big hit around its third season. Its first two seasons, people thought it was interesting. Some people thought it was really boring. But the third season in San Francisco, when they cast Pedro Zamora, who was, an out gay man, Latinx man, and also HIV positive, which was, it's kind of, you can't really overstate how significant that casting decision was, especially for 1994. So when that season comes out, again, The Real World now is really on the map. President Clinton is talking about them, things like that. But still, MTV is not making reality shows. What really forced their hand was the big drop in viewership for music videos, and also their changing demographics. So this is where we talk about this transition to millennial viewers, and this realization that millennial audiences really enjoy recording themselves and seeing themselves on screen and kind of being a part of what they're consuming, being active, essentially. And so that's when MTV starts doing these basically interviewing teenagers, filming the insides of their houses and their closets, and then bringing that research back to executives at MTV and saying, this is what kids like, and this is what they want to be doing. And it's at that time that MTV really kind of goes all in on reality TV, which is right around 2004 when Laguna Beach comes out.
Mm-hmm.
It takes like 12 years, really, from the start of The Real World to MTV really pivoting to reality television.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Amanda Ann Klein, author of Millennials Killed the Video Star. You can find more information about her work on the Duke University Press website or on Twitter at Amanda Ann Klein. If you like this episode so far, please like it and consider subscribing. All of my links can be heard at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. Yeah, looking at the time frame, the question I wanted to ask, or I'll ask, is the effect of the influence of social media on what we're seeing. And I did some quick research on, when exactly did social media get big? And I think some of the touch points or touch years were 2000, 2004, 2006, when like Instagram and Twitter developed.
So 2006 is kind of a general, if you're looking for kind of a date to throw out, a lot of people use 2006 as this moment where we switch from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0, which is the idea that the web goes from being a spot where you mostly consume, you take information, you search for information, you might find the article you're looking for. But Web 2.0 is this switch to you're not just consuming, you're creating, you're broadcasting, you are, posting your content. You're not simply taking content in. And that, I think, absolutely plays into the success of these MTV shows, because, you see Laguna Beach come out in 2004. And then in that time period, MTV is making a ton of these shows. And at the same time, Facebook, Twitter, in those early days, those were kind of the big social media platforms that encourage you to talk about yourself and encourage you to say who you are and what you're all about. And these MTV shows are also doing that in their own way.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't know if this might be beyond the scope of your book, but I know I recall other network stations were really pushing reality shows at some point. I can't remember when, but it seemed like it became a big broadcast network thing too.
Of course. Yeah. So the other big thing that, beyond MTV, and the reason why you see the 2000s as this turning point, has a lot to do with the industry itself and various writer strikes and, the rising costs of above the line talents. So the directors, the writers, the actors, it was just getting to be incredibly expensive. And then also, the audience is really segmenting. So, so every channel that's developed, you have, we have the same amount of eyeballs, but just more and more channels. So yeah, so they're always looking for ways to save money. And reality TV was an excellent choice for that. So that's why you see, right around 2000, you get Survivor, Big Brother, American Idol, all coming out and doing, exceptionally well.
Mm-hmm. And was that because of MTV's success, or was there
No,
something else?
no.
Okay.
No. MTV was also, so before Laguna Beach, there were some isolated reality shows. So MTV did a show called Sorority Life, which was, filmed inside of sorority. They did a show called Rich Girls about two very rich girls. So you can see kind of the prototype for something like The Hills or Laguna Beach. But yeah, no, this was something that was happening all across TV in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a lot to do with changes in the industry, changes in the media landscape, and things like that.
So how about now these shows aren't, they present themselves as natural, looks at what's going on, but they're heavily edited,
Oh,
where they, they try to mold how the characters are perceived and all that. Can you talk about that a little bit, the editing?
you mean specifically on MTV?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. And this was another thing that kind of drew me to this subject, was how different the aesthetics were across these different reality shows, even though they're all on the same channel and they're all about young people. Generally speaking, if you go back to kind of the history of documentary, there's often this desire for a kind of realism and authenticity. So the way that was generally communicated in documentary was with something called a long take. So that's where you don't cut. You kind of move the camera around. And that makes sense because you don't lose anything, right? If I want to film you doing something, if I'm cutting and editing, then we've lost some of time and space. But if I, just use one long take and follow you, I'm capturing everything. So we tend to associate very long shots with realism. We associate imperfection. So, if the camera's a little shaky because you're running to catch up with your subject, or you're trying to zoom in really fast because someone's crying, you want to catch that teardrop before it falls, that's a sign of authenticity. The lighting being imperfect, the subject's not looking their best, right? These are all hallmarks of what we would consider authenticity. And when we see that, our minds tell us, oh, that's documentary, or that's, realism. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the real world, they aimed for that for the most part. Mm-hmm. That kind of documentary tradition. But if you look at the reality shows coming out on MTV in the 2000s, they are not like that at all. So if you, when Laguna Beach first was released, followed by The Hills, people were very confused. They thought it was a scripted TV show due to its aesthetics. So they would do things like they filmed in widescreen, which is just bizarre for a reality show. So they used telephoto lenses so that you could get these beautiful, in focus shots of characters against a background. They did a lot with the film stock they chose to use. They wanted, for Laguna Beach, it was a lot of golden tones. They wanted it to feel very very beachy. And then when the same characters moved on to The Hills, they wanted to make it more blues and kind of steel colors. And so all of that thought on aesthetics is just really not what we associate. And it doesn't mean it's not a documentary, as I tell my intro to film students, but it's a different look, and it signals something different, which is you feel like you're kind of watching glamorous people in a glamorous television show. Mm-hmm. Even down to the fact that, the main characters in Laguna Beach and The Hills, they always look perfect on camera. Their hairs are always done. Their makeup's always on. They're always wearing the outfit they want to be wearing. Mm-hmm. That's generally not what you might see in, say, Big Brother or the real world, right? You catch them in the morning when they're hungover, when the mascara is, all over their face. On The Hills and Laguna Beach, everybody is always prepared for the camera. So there's no catching people off guard, down to the point where the production would tell cast members, I need you to call Lauren again. And talk about that fight that happened because we missed it. So even down to the editing of scenes, it's filmed like a movie because you only get shot reverse shot between two characters when you've planned out your shots ahead of time. You don't get that in a kind of on the fly documentary. So that really set that whole group of TV shows apart from reality TV, and sort of made the viewing experience feel different. It felt like these girls were in kind of this magical fantasy world. But then when you contrast that with a show like Jersey Shore, very different aesthetics. It looks like an old grindhouse movie. They purposely alter the look of the film stock so it looks like it has imperfections, like it's shaking in the projector. You see that in between scenes in Jersey Shore. Also, the characters where they're hanging out, it's a beach house, but they have the brown panel, fake wood panel walls, kind of tacky, kind of cheap. And again, it's a different aesthetic, and it's sort of, these people are low class, they're low brow. You'll certainly see them caught off guard. You see them getting punched. You see them vomiting. You would never see Lauren Conrad vomit on the hills. It's just never a thing that would ever happen. So I mean, even down to the aesthetics, you're getting really strong messaging about who these subjects are and kind of how to value them.
Mm-hmm. How much did MTV face any accusations of, I guess you couldn't call it racism so much as, well, stereotyping, just creating very negative stereotypes,
Oh,
and
yeah.
how did they respond?
They so when very famously, when they wanted to film Jersey Shore, there was a lot of pushback from Italian American organizations who really hate the word Guido and find it incredibly offensive. Although I will say the people who are on the show Jersey Shore feel totally comfortable with that word. They think it's sort of a reclaiming of it. So, I won't get involved in whether it's right or wrong to use the word, but just the idea of the show is very upsetting to local, both local New Jersey groups, but also to the larger kind of Italian American organizations.
Mhm.
I know when Buck Wild wanted to film in Sissonville, West Virginia, is it Joe Manchin? Is he the senator there?
That's
I think so.
good.
He wanted to block it because again, it's this feeling you're stereotyping our area. You're pigeonholing us. And I know that when Washington Heights was being made, there were definitely some Dominican Americans who they weren't upset about stereotyping because it wasn't really, that extreme, but they felt that it wasn't really authentic or realistic, and they didn't really capture the feeling of the neighborhood. So
Mhm.
so there's always, I mean, come on, we live in the internet age. There's always going to be complaints about things like that for sure.
So I would assume that the creators, producers, everyone involved in the production of these shows are fairly young, tend to be younger than average, maybe in the industry, or is that correct?
I would say not necessarily. I think for maybe tech crews, like I think people doing camera, sound, stuff like that might be on the younger side, because that's a good place to kind of learn your craft. But when it comes to like the producers, I don't think they're necessarily always the same age as the cast members themselves. And in fact, I mean, generally you don't really see it, right? But if you're a fan of Teen Mom and you've been watching over the last few years, you actually do get to see the producers. That's like a new thing they do where you can hear them talking to the cast members. And that gives you a good idea of the ages. There's people probably, some are probably in their 20s, but a lot are in their 30s, maybe early 40s. So, kind of an older figure in relation to these cast members.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm trying to figure out, on one hand, you have, they're trying to have conversations and learn, you know, in a way about things they're unfamiliar with, these characters, but on the other hand, it seems like just a wild exploitation of everything going on. So I'm trying to weigh, has it been useful for society, for American
Oh,
society, or not, or
I don't think I could answer that question. I obviously there is exploitation involved in anytime people are using themselves as a product, right? So if reality TV, the product is you, or if I'm tweeting, I am exploiting myself, right? I'm contributing to Twitter's overall value and putting myself out there for no financial reward, so it's all extremes of it. I do think you could certainly make some arguments about the relationship between reality TV and the last president that we had, and kind of how it alters the way we view the world and how we understand what talent or power or intelligence might be. But I don't know. I think it's entirely possible we would have had the presidency that we had without, reality TV. He would have found a different way to get himself in the spotlight. But yeah, I wouldn't blame reality TV for that.
So what about the casting? How was that done? I would imagine, again, with it being, again, manipulated to achieve a certain entertainment value. Do you have any information on how that was done?
Yeah, I mean, I think every show's a little bit different. And I think the time when the shows were released also makes a big difference because, the first season of The Real World, nobody knew what The Real World was. So, they didn't have I think they had some applicants, but it certainly wasn't what it was like, 5 or 6 years in when they'd get thousands and thousands of VHS tapes. Because that was how you tried out, is you would send like a video on a VHS and mail it to MTV. But they'd have lines around the blocks. They do like casting at local malls, so I think that's part of it, is how well known is the show, and how many people are actually throwing their hat in. Same thing with like Jersey Shore. I think, initially the first season you put out a casting call and you get a certain amount of people, but by season 2, it's a whole different, it's a whole different thing. I know for, Teen Mom, they would put out casting calls that, like, are you age 16 or younger and find yourself with a pregnancy? Do you want to, talk about it on TV or something like that? And so they'll put things out like that. And then how many people respond, I think, again, has a lot to do with how popular the TV show has become, how well known it is.
Okay. Before I turn to how you did your research for this, are there any other themes that we haven't discussed?
I mean, no, because we talked about all the different chapters. We talked about youth audiences and kind of identity and how MTV kind of played into that, and then how the channel just changed over time to appeal to a new audience. So those are kind of the big takeaways from the book.
Okay. And I saw in the blurb that you did interviews and such. So yeah, can you go into detail about how you put this together?
Yeah, I mean, I am, my work is generally in the realm of, history, theory, and cultural studies. So, when I started this, it was, watching a lot of the, rewatching and watching more of the content, looking at reviews and interviews with cast members and kind of overall media coverage from the time. Obviously what other scholarly work has been published. There's not a lot on MTV shows. I mean, there's definitely a lot on individual shows. Like, so you'll see, a bunch of articles on Teen Mom or The Hills, but mostly my research would be then on kind of the history of reality TV and, kind of knowing the place that this fit into the overall history. But in terms of the interviews, that was sort of an afterthought. I was prepared to just write this book, with the materials I just mentioned, looking at the text, looking at secondary sources on it, the public discourses. But I had written an article or a short piece about the TV show Catfish, and it was published at the New Yorker. And when I was sharing it, it got to the attention of one of the show's co-hosts, Max Joseph. And because of that, we ended up, chatting back and forth. And I finally was like, okay, maybe I should interview this person. That might be helpful. So I asked him, and he was very kindly said yes. And when our interview was over, he said, is there anyone else you want to talk to? And I said, well, actually, I'd love to talk to the creator of Teen Mom and 16 and Pregnant. And he's like, well, I don't know her personally, but we have the same boss. So he sent her an email and she agreed and she talked to me. And then she said, is there anyone you want to talk to? And I said, yeah, I'd love to talk to the creator of The Real World. So that was kind of how, so you really rely on the generosity of other people. Like, are they willing to give you an hour of their time? Mm-hmm. And so those came later. And so they were never really meant to be integral to the book so much as supplementary and ways to kind of further contextualize how certain decisions were made, such as, what kind of girl is right for Teen Mom, or, on Catfish, how do they go about picking people to be on the show? So kind of getting answers to stuff like that, I thought was really helpful. And it took some of the guesswork out of it for me. So, kind of getting it from the horse's mouth was really helpful. So yeah, so that was really how the research worked for this.
I'm speaking with Amanda Ann Klein, author of Millennials Killed the Video Star. You can find more information about her work on the Duke University Press website or on Twitter at Amanda Ann Klein. If you like this episode so far, please like it and consider subscribing. All of my links can be heard at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. So considering you are a fan of some of the shows, was there any point in the research or during doing interviews that you had a wow moment, like, ooh, like a fan moment?
Yes, every single person. It was crazy. I mean, growing up watching The Real World and being obsessed with it, and then having the opportunity to talk to Jonathan Murray was just, I mean, truly, it was unbelievable. And then, obviously talking to Max, he was so detailed and candid, and gave me so much of his time. And then Dia Sokol Savage, I mean, who created Teen Mom and 16 and Pregnant. And so getting to ask her questions, that just personal things that I wanted to know about was just really gratifying. But probably one of the most exciting interviews was with a former Real World cast member who is very iconic, named Irene McGee. And she was in the Seattle season. And even casual viewers of the show know her because she was slapped in the face when she was leaving the show by one of her castmates. And it was very scandalous. And so I got to talk to her. And when it was over, I thought, man, watching that show when I was a teenager, I just never thought I'd be having this long conversation, because she's only like a year or two older than me. And it was very surreal. It was very surreal because I remember wanting to be on the show, and she talked about why she had wanted to be on the show and how she tried out. So yeah, it was very interesting. As a fan of all of this stuff, it was really delightful.
Do you get the impression, or if you have enough information, the people who had been on these shows, were they happy to have done them, or is it left a bad taste?
I think it depends very much on who you talk to. I think that there are as many experiences as there are people. I can tell you I talked to 2 Real World cast members who had pretty much as opposing viewpoints on that as possible. Irene, I think, was left with a pretty bad taste in her mouth overall for a lot of different reasons. And then Paula completely felt differently. She thought that being on camera, talking about all of her problems, because she had a lot of serious issues, alcoholism, an eating disorder, an abusive relationship, things like that, self-harm. And she thought that being on that show kind of is what turned her life around and forced her to come to grips with her demons. And she felt she wouldn't have done it had she not been on The Real World, that she wouldn't have been able to grapple. So, I mean, you can't really get much more different than those reflections. So I would imagine if you grabbed any former cast member, they'd have some variation, on that, really.
So up to what year do you cover then? Where does it stop?
I'm done about, so the last show I talk about in any kind of detail is Catfish.
Mhm.
And I kind of gesture towards some newer shows that are on the air right now, like Young and Pregnant and Floribama Shore. But really, I'd say like right around 2018, maybe 2019 are the last years that I'm like looking at and talking about.
Mhm. How
You
how
have to
much
start
right,
somewhere.
yeah, I understand, yeah. How much did, and we've kinda touched on this a bit, but, how much did, people's practices of creating videos of themselves and sort of the both the visual and the, sort of the presentation of material, how much did that affect the aesthetic of these MTV shows?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think first, not even just, social media and everything else, but just watching reality TV, I think alters the way you would act if you were ever on a reality TV show. Because, you remember, oh, right. Remember somebody said something, like that and it was taken out of context. Boy, I better think about my words. So I think that alters it. But then on top of it, yeah, this ability to be able to take selfies of ourselves and to record ourselves is a kind of being comfortable and non not being awkward when seeing yourself being recorded. So like right now, I hate that I can see myself.
Yeah.
It's very unnerving. But I mean, I think for a certain segment of our population, that's very normal. They know their angles. They know where the light should hit them. They know how to present themselves. They know what kind of vision of themselves they want to project into the world. And I do think that is enabled by, and this isn't me saying this is, I think, a general theory that this is enabled by social media and certainly by reality television.
Mhm. Okay. What did you come across that most surprised you?
What did I come across that most surprised me? I was thinking about this because I saw that you had asked that.
Mhm.
What did surprise me? Hold on, I actually wrote this down. Um, Yeah, so I think one was what I've already mentioned was kind of what it made me think about myself growing up watching these shows. So, again, interviewing Irene after watching that series and having all these thoughts on her and what I would ask her, and then getting to ask her those questions. But also just kind of my status as a white upper middle class suburban child who was watching cable,
Mm.
in the 80s and 90s, and kind of understanding my subject position at the time and kind of rewatching these early seasons of The Real World and realizing how much I was identifying with the white cast members and kind of, you know, when they were confused because they didn't realize they were being racist, I at the time I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm confused too."
Mm.
And now looking back, I'm like, "God, that was really that was really dumb and I really didn't understand things." And so, it's I think that probably happens anytime you rewatch a text that you watched, as a young person and then review it as an adult. But for me, it was interesting because it also is part of my thesis, which is, kind of these viewing positions for white youth and kind of how MTV enabled that in a lot of ways. So that's probably the most surprising
Mhm.
for sure.
Was there a question you were hoping to get an answer for that was the most difficult for you to get to a conclusion, or maybe it's still an open question for you?
I think, the hardest thing was thinking about what was, anytime you do kind of a genre study where you're looking at a bunch of texts together, and you have to ask the question, what do I get from looking at all of these together that I wouldn't get if I looked at them individually? And for me, that was my research question, because I knew that all these TV shows were really interesting individually, and there was a lot to be said about all of them individually. But I knew that they could say something together, because they were all made within the same time period and by the same network, and going for the same audience and featuring cast members of the same so the question of trying to figure out what happens when I put all of them together, and what becomes illuminated when I think about all of these different texts as a cohesive cycle of production.
So you froze when you were saying cast members of the same. I didn't catch what you were
Oh, sorry. You
saying.
cast members of the same age. So,
Age.
they're all technically of the same generation. So, yeah.
Okay. What was there anything? Oh, actually, at this point, what do you think? Where's the cycle at this point? Is it upswing, downswing, even?
Well, so there's a lot going on, because on the one hand, as I was finishing my book, MTV was doing things like rebooting older reality shows. So having the Jersey Shore family reunion, which was several years after Jersey Shore went off the air. They had something called The Hills New Beginning, which I don't think went past a few episodes, but that was kind of a relaunch of the original Hills series that started in 2006. But then there are these also kind of, I wouldn't call them remakes, but they're sort of clearly inspired by previous successes. So Floribama Shore is like Jersey Shore, but Southern. Young and Pregnant is 16 and Pregnant. It's just a new group of people. Siesta Key is just the hills in Florida. So they're kind of just redoing all of these shows. So that's kind of happening on the one end. But what's also, I think, going to have a major impact on these shows and what MTV does going forward is the release or the premiere of Paramount Plus, which is the new streaming platform. And they have purchased, because it's the same parent company as MTV, they have MTV's back catalog of reality shows. So one of my biggest roadblocks when I was working on this book was getting my hands on the content, because I'd want to go back and rewatch certain shows. And there is no good place to get all of MTV's back catalog. They're very weird about it. They're kind of notorious for making it difficult to get older copies of shows. But Paramount Plus is going to have all of this stuff just out there in a big dump. So I am very curious if that triggers MTV to reboot some things or to put out a whole new slate of shows that are similar with new casts. But I would imagine it's going to have a major impact, especially one of the new shows Paramount Plus has is that Real World Homecoming, which is the original cast of the Real World back in the original loft, like 30 years later. So,
Oh, boy.
which is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I am watching it right now.
Wow.
So that's my answer to the question. I'm not sure, because I think the introduction of Paramount Plus is really going to have an interesting impact for sure.
When is Paramount Plus starting up? Do you know?
It's out already.
Is it? Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't even realize that.
And the Real World, I think they've aired 4 of the episodes already. So
okay.
I want to say they launched the whole platform maybe 2 months ago.
Okay. Wow, I'm behind the times already.
Yeah.
Was there anything you came across that had a strong emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
Oh. I will say I continue to be very moved by Teen Mom. I think it's because I started watching it for the first time after I had my second child. So, I had this toddler and I had this baby, and I'm watching these 16-year-olds with babies, and we're essentially having the same problems, but just in very, different contexts. And so I got very emotional. And then I think because of that strong bond, with these characters, that moment in time where I felt so connected that now as they're older and these older seasons where they become very self-reflexive and they're grown women now, and they're doing all these different things with their lives, and you hear them arguing and kind of talking about their lives with the producers on screen. And I find that to be very intense and emotional. And I do write about some of that in my 3rd chapter, because I find it to be very intense, emotionally speaking.
Yeah, no, I get that. So it seems like you had a lot of fun throughout this, but what part of it was the most enjoyable for you in the research?
Oh, geez. I think a lot of things. I really loved going back and watching the shows. I really loved delving back into MTV's history as someone, who grew up with MTV, kind of learning about really why it was made and its history, and then going back through the shows that led up to the real world, like that. It felt very nostalgic for me.
Mhm.
But then also, when I'm excited about a topic and I can sit down and write, I find that to be very enjoyable and cathartic as well.
Mhm. So, so going back and watching these both, the nostalgia hits, but you're also approaching it with a critical eye. Was there anything you saw that really gave you pause for some reason, like, that you didn't realize before as when you watched it when you were younger?
I mean, I think that the big thing was like watching the real world and really becoming aware that, oh, yeah, I'm just like acting just the way Julie is acting, and like rethinking interactions I had in my youth and how I talked to people. And, oh God, did I say that thing? Oh, at the time I thought that was a great thing to say, but now I can see, so it made me think a lot about those conversations that I had in my youth, that I thought I had a handle on things.
Hmm.
I mean, and honestly, I think that's a lot of what people enjoy with seeing young people on reality TV, is being able to say, "Oh, you stupid young person," I never did that, or I learned my lesson. So, yeah, it's interesting to have watched it as a teenager and then to revisit as an adult.
Mhm. What's your current, writing project, if you have one?
Oh my goodness. I'm just trying to get through the pandemic. Actually, so the only thing I've been kicking around, and I don't anticipate starting anytime soon, but I've been wanting to think a lot more about genre. So getting back into talking about film again, and with the popularity of sequels and franchises and kind of cross-platform content, where you have WandaVision, but then you also have the movies and all of this different stuff. What the role of genre and genre theory plays in this landscape. So if genre is a way to put order on a group of texts and to find their similarities and to see what is revealed by comparing them, um, do those critical tools work in the 21st century media landscape anymore? And if so, what does it look like?
Hmm.
And so for me, if I move forward with this, I'd probably use horror as my case study,
Mm.
because I think the genre of horror has had a real kind of renewal in cinema in the last probably 10 years.
Hmm.
And then in addition to that, it's such a clear cut genre, it's not really murky about whether something's a horror film or not. So I think it would be a good kind of case study to talk about the value of genre and generic categories. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what I'm kicking around right now, because it's something I think about a lot. And like, how do we talk about this stuff right now? And, is it more useful to call it a horror film or to call it part of the Conjuring franchise? And,
Hmm.
stuff like that. So
Yeah, one question I often ask, different people is, are superhero or comic books sci-fi or fantasy? And a lot of people just say they're their own thing, but
again, well, I guess it depends on why you're using one label as opposed to the other, and what it provides for you.
Mhm.
I guess, and also the lines between science fiction and fantasy. People could debate those all day.
Mhm.
I tend to see science fiction though as definitively a science generated threat that has to be overcome,
Mm.
right, at the end of the day. Whereas, in a superhero movie, there's science fiction elements, but there's also generally, there's just like a bad guy. Sometimes that bad guy's created by science, but not always. So
Mm.
that would be, but I am not a superhero person. So definitely don't ask me any follow-ups on that, because
Oh, I want to ask you one.
Oh, go on.
not about superheroes, but so what is what would you say fantasy is?
So, yeah, so my understanding is that fantasy is more about, again, kind of just like science fiction is, kind of these made up, couldn't really exist in the real world. But it's like that minus the science.
Hmm.
That's,
Okay.
but not necessarily the scary supernatural of horror. So it's kind of, there's in a Venn diagram, you could have all three of those, together.
Mhm.
In some way. I think you could there's plenty of movies that are horror, fantasy, and science fiction all rolled up into one.
Yeah. Hmm.
I'd have to sit down and think, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, is there anywhere online that people can follow your thoughts or updates on your works?
Well, yeah, I have a Twitter account. You could
Mhm.
follow me there. It's at Amanda Ann Klein.
Mhm.
That's my handle. Or you can just go to the Duke Press website and order my book.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. And I'll spell your name for listeners and viewers. It's so Amanda, Amanda. Ann is Ann,
Mhm.
and Klein, Klein.
That is correct.
Amanda Ann Klein on Twitter. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so with this book, so at the end of the day, what do you hope it will do for readers?
I hope it'll make them think more critically about these shows that they may not have thought too much more about, other than like, oh, it's the show with the Guidos. Oh, it's the show with the rich girls. I'd like to think that it'll give them a new perspective. And in terms of in my field and in, people who are scholars who are reading this book, I hope that it adds another kind of block to the tower of TV history that we're all building together. I hope it offers, it fills in a necessary gap in the history of reality television,
Mhm.
and also in the history of MTV. So
Missed a question I like to ask, which is, did you have any trouble getting the book finished or published?
I was lucky in that Duke was, interested when I was just drafting some chapters.
Mhm.
So I knew it had a home as I was working on it. But yeah, it takes a really long time. And what, even once you turn in your draft, they have to send it out to people to read and give you feedback. So and then even after you do all that, there's still all this, like get the proofs back and then the copy edits and pick out all the images and make sure that they're numbered correctly. And and there's so many people involved at the press itself who are contacting you. So it's always pretty amazing to me how much goes into just one book you're holding in your hand.
Mhm. So you use pictures from the shows then?
I used a variety of imagery. Some are still images from the shows. Some are, in the case where I talk about Teen Mom, I show one of their book covers because she wrote an autobiography, to contrast with another teen mom who appeared in pornographic films. So I have,
Mhm.
the cover of her pornographic film in the book too. So
Mm.
it's kind of a variety of images.
Do you get to use those under, what is it, fair
Yeah,
use?
fair use. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Um, all right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
I don't think I do. I think I talked a lot.
You covered a lot of stuff. It's,
Yes,
yeah,
I did.
interesting stuff. Um,
Yeah.
well, thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. In the next episode, I speak with Carol Savant, who's written about the horrific in the real world in the Victorian age. Hit the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, Please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.